Paul Cézanne is one of those pivotal painters who stand at the crossroads of art movements. Though involved with the Impressionist movement at first and influenced by its painters, he developed his own style which pointed the way forward for many of the post-Impressionists, of which he became one, of course, unlike Van Gogh, where you can clearly detect his influence, to the Fauves, the Cubists, and many of the avant-garde movements of the 20th century. In short, Cézanne was an unwitting trailblazer. In many ways a loner, a difficult man, we're told, but he knew his own mind, and art is the better for it. Renoir said of him, Cézanne has only to lay in one dab of color. It is nothing, and it is beautiful. Paul Cézanne was born in Aix-en-Provence in 1839. His father owned a bank. The family was therefore rich. Cézanne went to school with Émile Zola, who remained a close friend for much of his life. He studied law at university, but because of his passion for painting, failed to complete his course, and his family was well placed to support him financially when he enrolled at the School of Fine Arts in Aix. It was not until he was 22 that he first went to live in Paris for 6 months to visit the Louvre and the Salon. He was not impressed and returned to Aix and joined his father's bank, saying, "The sky of my future is completely black." Zola wrote of him at the time, "He is obdurate and hard. Nothing bends him. Nothing can drag a concession from him." However, painting was in his blood, and back he went to Paris to work at the Académie Suisse, a private studio close to Notre Dame. He began to submit work to the Salon, but it was continually refused. These failures to break in went on for some number of years. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, he left Paris to live in L'Estaque, near Marseille, where his mother had a property, and only returned at the end of hostilities. He became a frequent visitor of the Café Guerbois, which you may remember from the Manet talk became the unofficial headquarters of the Impressionist movement. There he socialized with Monet, Bazille, Renoir, Sisley, and of course, Manet. Yet the new Impressionist style didn't quite satisfy him, and he never fully embraced the movement. His technique was too deliberate and rarely as spontaneous as the others. He told the poet Kashays, "Sensation is the basis of everything. I want to be a true classical painter, to be classical through nature." Now, this is the first painting I'm going to show you today, Bend in the Road. He's quite fond of bends in the roads, we shall see later on. And I think it's fairly obvious that the influence there is certainly dabs of color, as Renoir said, and it's Impressionist in style, as you can see. And there's a great fondness for green. The fondness for green never left him. Various shades of green. But there's very little detail in this painting. There is a house right in the center there. We can just make out its roof, its flat roof, and its chimney maybe. But that's pretty well all the detail there is in that painting. This is a very early one, of course. It's quite small as well, 20 by 19. It was in 1874 that Cézanne met Pissarro, whom Cézanne thought of as something like a god the father. Pissarro told him, "Paint only with three primary colors, the three primary colors, and their immediate derivatives. In other words, mix your colors from the three primaries." So his greens almost certainly would have been blues and yellows mixed. At the Impressionist third exhibition in 1877, Cézanne again entered his work, but with more success on this occasion. He entered this painting called the Negro Scipio. which is now in Brazil. But it hung in his bedroom for quite considerable time, we're told, and he considered it a work of the greatest strength. So there we're starting to see certain characteristics of his paintings that never left him, and that particularly is the strong outline, as you can see there, very strong outline, heavily loaded brushes, almost impasto painting. It probably would qualify as impasto painting, and maybe some of that paint put on with the palette knife on occasions. But the composition is very strong. We've got this huge sweep. The spine is curved, and it goes right to the bottom of the painting there, and continues where he's leaning on some sort of material, so maybe a piece of furniture that's covered. We don't know what it is exactly, but it's quite a striking painting, as I think you'd agree. Here is Cézanne at the age of 38. He was a man with a single vocation. On the day of his mother's funeral, he went out painting instead of attending the service. There were few women in his life, but for his mother and his wife Hortense, whom he married after she'd given birth to their son, Paul. The first period of his painting life is called the Goyard period, his ballsy period, we might say. Courageous, determined, vigorous, and daring. It suited his youthful temperament. And we can see here typical painting of that time, painted in 1867, called The Orgy. So very, as you can see, very little expense paid to detail, expensive effort paid to detail, and the flesh colors of the nudes or the partly dressed people are mirrored in the drapery above there, above the painting. Very colorful, heavily labored with paint, and there we are. I'll let you make your own minds up about that. This one is called The Thieves and the Donkey. And again, impressionist in style more than anything else, especially the tree, as you can see. Quite what's going on in this bottom left-hand corner, we don't know, but I suspect there is a victim in the middle of all these three men, and he or she is being attacked and thieved from. Then we've got the donkey there right in the middle. I don't know why he symbolizes. We've got an upturned cool cauldron there, and a guy here who's loading his gun, I would suspect. So it's quite a dark painting, really, with flashes of red, as you can see, but the overall impression of it is that it's dark violets there on the left. And that's quite a small painting too, 16 by 21. Then we have Magdalene in Sorrow. This is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. This is a curious painting. Again, we've got the heavy dark outlines and the thick layers of paint slapped onto the painting. No real attempt at any sort of representation at all. I would imagine that his model is unrecognizable. In fact, I'm not sure, although we know it's Mary Magdalene, it is almost a masculine features to my mind. And then we've got this curious little head here, which doesn't seem to have a body. So, and then we've got these three objects, presumably because they might be spoons attached to the wall. So it's a curious painting, this, but very typical of his style at the time. Cézanne, a picture was a certain arrangement of lines, angles, and color. This one is of Aquil Emperor. There's a dwarf hunchback and a friend from Aix. He was also a fellow painter. And all these paintings are done in thick impasto, the pigments almost troweled on, as you can see. And this dwarf has, his subject is resting his feet on a book, which could well be a Bible, but I'm not sure. There's nothing on it to indicate what the book is. Cézanne has signed it in the bottom right-hand corner there, as you can see. So how lifelike that is, we don't know. I suspect not particularly, but he would be, I'm guessing he would be recognizable. And this unusually is a large painting. It's over 6 foot by 4 foot. So that would be very impressive to see in the gallery. And this one, Stove in the Studio, a dark painting again, dark colors, contrasted with the rear of this canvas, which is waiting for him to work on, presumably. This painting for me points towards Van Gogh and the many paintings he did of his own interiors, his studio and his bedroom. And again, well, not again, because I haven't really mentioned it yet, but you will notice as we go along that he appears to paint with not a particularly true eye. So to me, this stove is slightly veering towards the right, I would say. I'll leave you to decide whether you agree with that. But we've got this little bit of color there, the embers in the stove, but it's mainly a very dark painting. It was probably painted in Paris, and its first owner we know to have been his friend and the writer Émile Zola. His landscapes from this period are similarly impressive. This one is Melting Snow at L'Estaque, painted in 1871, upon his return back to Paris after the war. That's quite an arresting painting, I think. We've got the dark landscape and the lowering skies here, mainly violets, dark violets. And this sweep of snow, which completely dominates the painting from right to left, makes this roof here in this particular house in the bottom right-hand corner look extremely precarious and threatened by what appears to be a lance or an avalanche in the making here. There is a sense of movement in this painting, I think. And he's achieved that by the way he's put the paint onto the canvas with large, broad strokes. So I'll let you look at that for a moment. He said this was painted for emotional impact, and I think that's, we certainly have to fear for the people in this building at the bottom right there. The railway cutting, painted the same year, is of a different ilk altogether. Much brighter. We started to see these oranges which he favoured later on. We're going to see a lot more of this mountain at Aix. It was called Saint Victoire, and he painted it an awful lot in various styles. As I say, it's very colourful, bright painting. Painted near Aix. His compositions were becoming simpler, as in this one, the Delft Vars with flowers, quite a small one again, only 16 by 11. And you can see, following the advice of Pissarro, he's dealing with, he's painting with large dabs of colour. The vase itself is just a potpourri of whites and ultramarine, I suppose, and maybe Prussian blue and dark colour as well. No attempt really to show the glare that it might normally reflect light. In fact, there's no real sensation of of where the light is coming from, unless it's coming from the left, maybe on these flowers here. But basically, these are large daubs of color, dabs of color, without any attempt to represent the vase and the flowers. Nevertheless, they are obviously recognizable, and quite clearly he's more interested in the way the colors work together. We have the reds and the greens, and we'll see a lot more of the reds and the greens. This one is called the fishing village at L'Estaque, which is where he was staying. Slightly more transparent, I think the colors are here, so he might have put them on with a slightly weaker, as a weaker wash maybe, although these roof tiles here are painted with a considerable amount of contrast. There's very little blending of the shadows. The shadows are just thick black lines or dark blue lines, depending on what he was coloring. This painting is, to me, is a bit weak in areas like that. In the bottom left-hand corner, it's just it's almost like a smudge, I think you'd say. And the predominant color is this sort of very pale orange, mixed probably with yellow ochre. In 1873 and 74, Cézanne went to Auvers, where Pissarro lived, to stay with Dr. Paul Kashays. It was there he painted this painting, a modern Olympia, inspired by Manet's painting. It's said that Cézanne had a burst of inspiration amid a heated discussion, during which he sketched out a version of the Manet painting. We're not told who he had the discussion with at the time. Cézanne uses transparent, bright colors, as you can see, painted in the Impressionist manner. It was exhibited in the first Impressionist exhibition, but was poorly received. Now, I'll just remind you of the Manet painting, which the Manet painting, Manet's Olympia, which we're told inspired that painting, and most of the elements are still there. So we've got the nude, and we've got the black servant, the curtain, and the large mass of flowers. A minute. All right, there we are. And again, we've got the nude there, we got the flowers, we've got the black servant pulling away the drapes or removing a curtain or whatever. But Cézanne has added a client sitting on the couch here, as you can see, and making it more explicit as to what is going on. The client in the Manet is assumed by the flowers, or represented by the flowers. In the Cézanne, the flowers are coming out of a huge jardinière. And it's the whole painting, and it's not a big painting, 18 by 22, is done very freely, as you can see, very free brushstrokes, very bright, and on the extreme left here, it's impossible to see what it is actually, but he just as though he's just put reds and violets, lilacs together there, and this almost as though this piece of furniture here, this red startling piece of furniture, which almost tends to dominate the painting, and certainly balances the client waiting on the sofa there. That almost looks as though it was painted with a drunken paintbrush, if such a thing could exist. In 1877, he painted a rather austere portrait of Madame Cézanne sewing. Again, we've got the dark outlines. You notice with the fabric that she's working on, we're starting to get geometric shapes involved, rather than a gentle sweep of the fabric. And we're going to see a lot more of that at Cézanne. That's a signature style for Cézanne. She would be recognizable from that painting, but he's not interested in painting with smooth flesh-toned skin. Features are quite heavily labored there, I think. But there's a nice contrast between this pale lilac and the Venetian red background there. I don't know what she thought of the painting, but he painted her several times, and I don't think she would have been particularly impressed by any of them, depending on how she thought of herself, I suppose. However, this is how he painted himself. So in 1875, and again, impressionist, would you say? What we see here is that his portrait is sort of subsumed into the background. These light pink clouds appear to pass over his face. But he's certainly captured his own personality in this painting, I think, without going into any detail. Quite a striking painting. And we can see the light source is from the left. And then his clothes, his painter's smock, or whatever it is, very dark. So there's quite a lot of contrast in this painting between his dark smock and the light catching his forehead there. Rather a successful painting, I think. But again, not a large painting. It's in a private collection somewhere, 26 by 22. Now then, other notable works from this period spent at Auvers include the house of Pear Lacroix. I really like this painting. And we're starting to see the greens being contrasted with the reds. Now, any redhead, especially a lady, or a woman or a girl, would always attempt to go for green because of the contrast. So you often see redheads wearing green, don't you? And they work so well together, particularly in this painting. It's a bright, light painting as well, not a big paint, not a large painting, 2 foot long by 20 inches. But painted in the Impressionist style. There's just an impression of the house there. Whether it would be recognizable, it possibly would. And we're starting again to get these geometric shapes in the foliage at the back here. Like you see, you've got a definite rectangle of red there, and another one there, and then a triangle there, and then the whole movement there is from the right to left, as though suggesting movement, maybe a storm, maybe wind. But this is typical Cézanne. But because it's painted in with a bright palette, I think, or a light palette, I think it works very well. But you can see this on the stucco here, how heavily the paint is put onto the canvas there. It's almost lumpy in places. It's just dried off in bits and lumps. And this is Dr. Kashays' house where he was staying. Which is his house, we don't know. It could be this tall house here maybe, or it could be this one there. And you'll see another bend in the road, which he's quite fond of. And the colours are not so strong in this. They were weakened possibly by using white spirit or whatever, but the greens on either side of the road are quite transparent and weak. We might not be afraid of using the word weak. But the painting is bright again. There's a suggestion of wind from the branches on the left there, and there's no foliage on the trees, so it must be presumably a midwinter scene. Despite that, he's painted it with a light palette. The most famous painting of his Impressionist period is undoubtedly The Hanged Man's House, which I'm taking to be this house on the left, because there is a thatched roof here, but so we're not quite sure which one of these houses is the hangman's house, and we don't know anything about the hangman either. And there's the village in the background from which he came. Under the influence of Pissarro, his palette has, as we've seen, grown lighter, though his paint is applied thickly, sometimes by a palette knife, as I've already suggested. The more architectural construction of space reveals how he's slowly moving away from Impressionism. This was the first painting he sold to a collector, and when exhibited, it was poorly received by the public. There's a dominance of green in this painting, sort of green and green mixed with yellow ochre, I would say, but the overall effect is of green. I'll leave you to look at that for a moment. I'm not sure whether I like that at all. Though he lived simply on his allowance that his father made him, he was from time to time forced to sell his paintings at the exhibitions organized by the Impressionists, and these were largely unsuccessful. Cézanne contributed 17 canvases to the third Impressionist exhibition in 1877, but without much success. The critic Leroy warned the public not to show the portrait of Victor Chauchat, which was one of the paintings he exhibited, to a pregnant woman. He wrote, "The impression it might produce could cause yellow fever in the fruit of her womb." Sounds a bit strong to me, but on the other hand, another critic, Georges Rivière, said Cézanne is a painter and a great one. His still lifes so beautiful and so exact in their tonal relations, have something solemn about them in their truthfulness. The artist moves us because he himself feels such a strong emotion when confronted with nature, and he transmits this to the canvas. So there we've got two opposing views, contemporary views of Cézanne's paintings. Renoir painted Victor Chauchat as well, and from the Renoir painting, he's far more recognizable. He is recognizable from this. Notice his huge hands. His hands interlocked there, disproportionately long, I would have said. But because of course, he's got the bushy, the wavy hair and the beard and the long face, quite easy to make him recognizable, I would say. But again, we've got the dabs of color that Pissarro advocated, and heavy outlines again, dark shadows, very dark shadows, contrasting with the white of his socks then. So heavy contrast, very colorful. And I don't know, is this pointing towards the Fauvists of the early 20th century in its use of color? Maybe we could say that. This is another self-portrait painted in 1879. However, after the exhibition, Cézanne made the decision to divorce himself from the Impressionists, to be freed from the beasts, is how he put it, and he moved from Paris back to Provence. There he began his so-called constructive period. He began, in his own words, to treat nature according to the sphere, the cylinder, and the cone, with everything put into perspective so that each side of an object or a plane is aimed towards a central point. Now, with those words in mind, no wonder some consider him to be the inspiration behind Cubism. In other words, he created new spatial relationships which differed from the conventional perspective. Now, this is a painting of Lestat, and we can start to see, if you look at the mountains there, you can start to see the hard outlines of the shapes. They're built up of shapes of triangles, rectangles, rhomboids, trapeziums, whatever. But they are basically, and it's almost as though he's painted them with a flat brush. This isn't a large painting either, so maybe he didn't, maybe he didn't. But you can certainly see what he means by painting with the sphere, the cylinder, and the cone. And if we come back down to the foreground of the painting, with his greens and his yellows again, we've got these. We got this chimney stack here, which is a very definite geometric shape. Not so quite so obvious in this, but in this painting. But you certainly in the mountains you can see the style developing. Then we've got another painting of Madame Cézanne here. Again, not very flattering, I think you'd agree, but he's more interested in the style he's painting. And I don't want to keep laboring the point, because I'm sure you're starting to recognize all the key elements of Cézanne's paintings now, so that they're completely recognizable from any other painting. But nevertheless, you will see again the dark outline. The creases are just strokes of dark paint, very dark Prussian blue maybe, and the pattern on the dress is painted heavily, thickly, and then we've got the contrast with the red furniture. He seems to like red furniture, Cézanne. It might have just been that they happen to have red furniture in the house. And then surely this face is pointing towards Gauguin, isn't it? With this color, with this use of orange, light orange, and lemon yellow, and yellow ochre, and then using the blues as shadows, and there's two dark black holes for her eyes. So no attempt at representation again, but she would probably, I'm sure, be recognizable from this. Though again, what she thought of it, we can only surmise. This is a painting of his father's country house near Aix, Yas de Bouvon. And here we see a simplification of vision, looking forward to Gauguin again, and Rousseau more likely, I think. And it actually is the result of long, patient application. So it might give the impression it's quickly dashed off en plein air, as the Impressionists did. There's a lot of work gone into this painting, we're told, and a lot of patient application. So I'll let you just absorb that. I don't think there needs to be any explanatory comments from me, really. In 1880, he painted the Poplars. This is in the Louvre. He was now experimenting with landscapes, reducing forms to their essential shapes, emphasizing the vertical line of the trees. So again, Impressionist in style, but we've got these trunks of the trees sweeping up from the ground, as they do in poplars and pines, of course. And then the foliage is stroked on, again, the appearance of a flat brush. We don't know whether it was, but we've got these rectangular shapes again, and triangles maybe. So it's up to you to decide whether you think it works or not. This painting looks a confusion of greens and very light browns to me, and I think there's a building in the background there, but it's not not a large painting. Again, 24 by 31. This is Village Seen Through the Trees, painted in 1885, and this painting emphasizes his love for orange, as you can see, orange to yellow at the bottom there, contrasting with the greens, not too apparent, the greens and the dark shadows of the trees there, and then we've got the actual trunks, of course, sweeping up as we did with the poplars, and then with the roofs of the houses in the village. Again, we got these geometric shapes, haphazardly painted in, I think, just to give the impression of a village there, village roofs. But the overall emphasis, I think, of this painting is the clash of colours, the orange, and the orange is picked up in the mid ground of the painting as well, as you can see there. And even in the sky, there's faint suggestions of orange there. And again, we've got this red-green combination, which he's so fond of. At about this time, he painted several Harlequins. This one is just simply called Harlequin, painted 26 by 36. So very colourful. We've got the diamond shapes, of course, the Harlequin, and on the Harlequin's uniform. That might have been what had attracted him to start to paint Harlequins. We don't know. And then the shape of the hat was probably also attracted him. There's and then also the Mardi Gras. This is in Moscow, in Pushkin Museum, and we're told that this Harlequin, for this Harlequin, he probably used his son Paul as a model, and quite what the white Piero is doing behind him. He seems to be pushing him forward. So there's not much narrative in this painting, but it's very, very colourful. A little larger than some of the others, over 3 foot tall. And we've got the sweep of the drapery behind, clashing with again, the lilacs and the pale blues that he likes to use, and they've sort of drifted into and picked up again in the floor, which is no detail in the floor whatsoever. A bit of a skirting board there maybe, but that's all. He's not interested in that. He's interested in colour and shapes and composition. That's what Cézanne is interested in. And now we come to the card players. I'm sure you're all familiar with this painting. He painted 5 versions of the card players. This one is in London, in the Courtauld Institute in London. 2 of which have 3 players and onlookers in the background. This one has only the 2 players. And we can see there's a bottle there, and it's not quite so clear, but the next one I'm going to show you, the bottle acts as a division between the 2. In fact, I'll move on to one of the other versions. Now, this is in the d'Orsay Museum, essentially the same composition as you can see, but you can see the bottle clearer there because the reflection makes the division line quite clear. And so you've got the lighter player on the right and the slightly darker player on the left. And again, the same with the London version. But essentially the same composition and painted in the same style. I particularly like this cow coat, if that's what it is, that the guy on the right is wearing. I like the way he's used various colours and let them meld into one another. The yellows and the yellow umbers up there, and the blues and the lemon yellows. It works extremely well, I think. It's basically impressionist in style, except that he's used paint heavily again, and his outlines are very dark and very definite, so they accentuate the areas of colour that he's painting. So the arm, for argument's sake, there. No attempt to paint the hands realistically, although they are definitely hands. And as I mentioned before, to me, both paintings, they're not quite true. It's as though they might be painting on board a ship in a storm. You definitely can see that this table veers from right to left. a slightly wonky table, we'd have to say. But if we look at the background there, and this is some sort of a screen of separating an inner room, maybe, we don't know. It's too vague to be able to say what exactly it is. But that line again is not quite straight. Not that it matters in the slightest. And the same again there. It's not quite straight. In fact, the top of this section doesn't quite marry up to me with the other side of the card player's head. But there we are. Oranges again, of course. So what else have we got to say about the card players? Right. One version sold in 2011 to the royal family of Qatar for an estimated $250 million. So these are seriously expensive paintings to buy. The genre paintings of the 17th and 18th centuries, especially the Dutch and the well, Hogarth. You can think of Hogarth as well in England, but particularly in Holland, I would say. They often depicted rowdy, drunken gamblers in taverns, scenes like this, whereas Cézanne's pictures show a total lack of drama and narrative. These are two local peasants, probably workers from his father's estate, studying intently their cards. No cards the game hasn't started yet because there are no cards on the table, but that doesn't matter. What matters is the color and composition. And I think these card players are really wonderful paintings. From 1890 to 1895, he painted 4 versions of Boy in a Red Waistcoat, and here they all are. They all measure roughly 31 by 26, and all but one have found their way to the USA. The boy that he used as a model was a young Italian boy by the name of Michelangelo di Rossa. The boy's pose complements the intensity of the coloring. These paintings led to his final period, which is often referred to as post-impressionism. So they're all basically the same, well, the different poses, of course, but it's the same idea of the strong, powerful red color of the waistcoat contrasted with the white or paleness of the shirt that he's wearing. So no real attempt at a likeness. I don't think we would recognize this boy necessarily. These slightly feminine features, I think. I like this one particularly because of the contrasts of the color and the typical Cézanne heavy contrast and dark outline. And the red is very virulent, I think. Very vivid red there. By now, his father had died in 1886, and Cézanne was the beneficiary of a huge inheritance and no longer had any money worries. In the period beginning 1895, he painted over 300 canvases at a furious pace. Among them were 20 versions of the Bathers. This one, completed in 1905 and found its way to Philadelphia, is the largest and often referred to as the large Bathers. It remained unfinished at the time of his death. The adaptation of the nude form to the triangular pattern of the trees and river employ much the same geometric technique as his landscapes and still lifes. It's easy to see how the inspiration of Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon may have arisen from it. And there's the Picasso painting, so that you can get an indication of where he might have been inspired from the Cézanne's, the painters. I mean, the bathers, I should say, the bathers are little more than mannequins in various attitudes and poses. What is startling about this painting, of course, is the strange bend of these trees, which is totally unrealistic, but they do frame the painting. It's a large painting. This is 83 inches by 99 inches, so it's a very large painting, and heavily dominated by blues, I think you would say, and the blue contrasting, and no attempt really at flesh tones, made up basically of whites and very, very pale yellows and very even paler orange, maybe. It's this particular nude here, or bather, is a slightly different color to the rest of them, and quite what they're doing at the bottom here, we don't know. Maybe they're laying out a picnic or something like that. Anyway, here's a photograph of Cézanne in 1904, sitting in front of one of the versions of the bathers, not the one you've just seen, a slightly different version. But you can see the trees again of leaning towards the top center of the painting. Looking like a venerable old man now. And this is only, this photograph was taken 2 years before he died. So he's well in his 60s now. Other examples of his post-impressionist period, and that's where we are now, in the post-impressionist period of the 1890s, are this still life with a skull, painted in 1898. Now we're starting to see Cézanne's apples appear. Cézanne famous for painting fruit, of course, as we know, and he paints them very vividly. Again, we got the very dark outlines of the fruit. Not very realistic, as you would see, but it doesn't matter, because it's all he's interested in really is the colors, the contrasts of the colors complementing one another, and the composition. I mean, the skull of skulls are never that color, are they, in real life? But he just cannot resist using oranges, and particularly orange, and orange veering towards yellows, and there's a touch of Venetian red in there as well, whereas the cavities are very dark indeed. So there's a heavy contrast in this painting, and you can tell that the painting is again thickly applied. Look at the tablecloth, the mushed up tablecloth here. It's no attempt at recreating a realistic version of the creases. It's just it's just there, isn't it? And again, if you look at the perspective of this table, it is a rickety old table. He must have had a lot of rickety furniture, because if you follow the outline of the top of the table there, between these two folds of the tablecloth, if you follow that along, you'll see that it's out. It doesn't quite match up there. So this part of it is going upwards, and this part is going slightly down. You've got to have a true eye to be able to see that, I suppose. But the whole impression of this table is that it's badly made, which I doubt it is. There are more apples, and again we've got things or objects slightly akimbo. This bottle is veering towards the left slightly, whereas the table top itself appears to be fairly true. The basket of apples is tipped over, and the apples have just spilled out onto the tablecloth here. And so what, you might say? It's the wonderful colours which point towards I think might have influenced the Fauve painters, Matisse and Chirico, and etc. Very startling painting. Not a large painting, 2 foot by just under 2 foot, but very startling. And again, we've got the reds and the oranges and the greens of the apples. And some attempt made at catching the light on the glass, but it's the shape of the bottle which gives it away, of course. Pines at Bibermus, if that's how you pronounce it. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it. Another painting painted towards the end of his life, this one in Germany. And again, you can see the geometric shapes of the rocks, and the oranges and the greens. These are all very typical Cézanne now. You must be used to them by now. I haven't seen so many of these paintings this morning. And then we've got the other colour that he liked to use was the violets, just creeping in there. So I think I'll just let you look at that one and absorb it. And then 2 portraits now. There's probably you recognize the old woman with the rosary, the way she's bent forward there, looking very intent on her prayer, counting her beads. Very dark painting, as you can see. And typically no attempt at realistic flesh tones, but her face is brightly lit by very, very, very pale orange mixed with yellow ochre, I would think. And she looks, there's a certain tristesse about this painting. I think we think of this woman maybe a widow, and certainly alone. She looks, it's an epitome of loneliness, I think, and dedication to prayer, I suppose you'd have to say. But then we get the pipe smoker, another powerful portrait, leaning his head, his weary head on his hand, while smoking his pipe, although his pipe appears to have gone out. And again, we can see the way Cézanne paints fabric, clothes, if you like. They're basically dashes of color from his paintbrush, and trying just to meld one color like greens with very, very pale violets there, and then introducing yellows at the top there, and the oranges, of course, will creep in. So these are quite pale colors. They're not strong colors, but the outline, of course, is always very strong, very powerful. Look at the shadow down there of his arm there, and into his armpit as well. Very strong. But a face full of character. A man who knows plenty about hard work. A man who's worked outdoors most of his life, I should say, but not particularly old, maybe in his mid-40s perhaps, because of course his life was hard. And this curious hat on his head tipped back in a sort of jaunty fashion. So, and the table is built up of rectangles or sort of linear elements, laminates, if you like. Not quite sure what it is. He's really only interested in how the colours and the forms work together there. This painting is in the Hermitage, as you can see. In 1902, Cézanne fell out with his great friend Zola after the publication of his novel, L'Œuvre. Now, Cézanne recognized himself in the hero of this novel. I don't know whether any of you have read it. I have many years ago. And it's not a very flattering portrait of a struggling artist, impressionist artist in Paris. And Cézanne was not impressed because I think he rightly or wrongly assumed that it was based on him. And they fell out and never really close again. Perhaps it'll be for his late landscapes for which he will be best remembered. Remember, I talked about this, his local mountain, as it were, in Aix. This is Mont Sainte-Victoire, which he painted many times. This version in 1895. Again, all the typical Cézanne components are there, the strong lines, the shapes, the geometric shapes, the heavy outlines, the contrasting colors, the greens, the oranges, the reds, they're all there. And the result is a startling landscape, I think. And a landscape surely pointing towards the 20th century. This is a very typical post-impressionist painting, you'd have to say. This one he called Blue Landscape. We're back to daubs of colour, really, dabs of colour. I should be careful by conflating the two terms, daub and dab. But you can see how he's built the painting up. It's quite a large painting, really, considering there's not much detail in it. 2 foot by 2'6", and there is a property again there in the middle, just suggested. And then we've got areas here where there doesn't seem to be any paint at all, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So that's a dark blue and dark green landscape. I don't know how you feel about that. Back to the bend in the road. This is much lighter painting, as you can see. And again, the details of the rock formation here built up with small planes of colour with gaps in between. Now the spaces, we're told, and I'm not convinced by this, that he deliberately left spaces between the colours because they're transitional areas where 2 colours placed side by side could not be blended to his satisfaction. So this is typical of a painting where there appear to be areas of canvas showing through, but I'm not convinced by that explanation, and I'm sure that isn't canvas. On the bottom left-hand corner there is a slight hint of lilac in that area there. But it's a much brighter, lighter painting, of course, and just built up with areas of colour. I think that's what you'd have to say, without any detail at all. The brush going one way to show the hills in the background, and then north to south, if you like, to show the trees. Bend in the road. And there's the mountain again, Mont Sainte Victoire. More use of violet and greens and yellows with this one. The paint, the houses are rather indistinct. I'm not sure I like this painting particularly. I think it's a bit of a confusion, to me, a confusion of colours, really. I preferred it when he made it slightly more clear what was going on in the mountain. Even the mountain seems to have lost its shape in this one. This is far more successful, I think. Rooftops. In the last period of his life, he turned to watercolours in pursuit of transparency and luminosity. A free handling of colour lent itself to his genius, as can be seen in this painting, painted in 1898. So this is, these colours are applied more freely, they're thinly applied, as you might expect from a watercolour. That's a sweeping generalisation that somebody can pick me up on, no doubt, later. But again, there appear to be areas that are not painted on, but I just do not accept that explanation that they're there because he couldn't satisfactorily meld the neighbouring colours. I don't see that at all, to be honest. But this is very much a Fauvist painting, I think, very much in the style of the later Fauves. Oh, they weren't that much later than 1898, early part of the 20th century, so they could well have been influenced buy a painting like this. This is Woods at Chateau Noir. And just let you look at this painting because it's absolutely typical Cézanne, late Cézanne. I'm not going to go through all the elements as why it's typical, because you'll know that by now. Le Cabanon de Jourdain. Slightly weaker in outline, this painting. Much freer hand with the paintings of the foliage and the building on the left. And the door, he's used these blues, the pale blues and lilacs of the sky to pick out the door. And then he's brought it in over on the right there as well. And then the oranges and reds, Venetian reds he's used, and the chrome yellows are spilling out down the painting onto the footpath at the very bottom there, so that we've got a swirl of color in this painting. I think we can use the word swirl with impunity. While painting in the countryside in 1906, Cézanne was caught in a storm. On his way home, he collapsed. A passing carter found him and took him home, where he revived for a time, so that he was working again the next day. But at some stage, we're told, he had a relapse and took to his bed, where he died of pneumonia a few days later, aged 67. He was buried in his hometown of Aix, and this is his last self-portrait, painted roughly 10 years before he died. Instantly recognizable as Cézanne, with the proud, large forehead, domed forehead, and of course the beard and the piercing dark eyes. Uncompromising portrait, I think, an uncompromising man. And there's a photograph of him in the 1890s. The following, I think this photograph demonstrates his prosperity, probably, in how he's dressed. Quite a distinguished gentleman there, I think. The following year, after his death, there was a Cézanne retrospective at the Salon d'Automne, which greatly influenced the direction taken by the avant-garde in Paris. Cézanne's explorations of geometric simplification and optical phenomena inspired Picasso, Braque, and the other cubists to experiment with complex perspectives of the same object. In fact, it may be said that he is hugely responsible for the way modern art and the post-impressionist movement developed. And we'll let Picasso, therefore, have the final words on Cézanne, when he said, "He is the father of us all," and Picasso claimed him as my one and only master.